Good afternoon, Patriots. This is the American Vision, broadcast on the TLBTV network and brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Project. I'm your host, Bill Muckler, and today I'm broadcasting from my home studio in Cocoa, Florida on America's beautiful Space Coast. And I'm really excited to have probably the greatest guest I've had so far, Dr. Andrew Holt, who is coming to us from his home studio in St. Augustine, Florida. And Andrew, welcome to the show.
Well, Bill, thanks a lot for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So I got to know Andrew through his father-in-law, Mike Buckler, who's no relation, Buckler and Muckler, and we belong to the St. John's Evangelist Church in Viera, Florida, and we met through Christ Renews His Parish. So and I learned about Andrew and his book, and I'm really excited about this book. I've read the book. Actually, I bought the book in on the Kindle version so I could read it on my Kindle, but I also got Andrew to sign it for me. See, so he's another author that likes to sign books, just like all of us. So this book is the most informative book I've ever heard of on and read on the myths of the Crusades, and it's entitled 7 Myths of the Crusades. So Andrew is an associate professor of history at Florida State College in Jacksonville. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Bill.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved in history and your passion for history, and you know, where you're from originally, you know, some of those types of things for our viewers.
Well, you know, as they say to begin at the beginning, but don't worry, I won't take too long with this. I was born in Pittsburgh. I actually lived there until I was about 9 years old, and then my father passed away, so my mother and I and my brother and sister all moved down to St. Augustine, and so I grew up in the South, but I felt like I was growing up in a house full of Pittsburghers, you know, and so it was a little different experience for me. But anyways, I wasn't always that interested in history. It was later in my life when I decided to return to school. I was in my late 20s, and I finished up an associate's degree at the local community college. And part of the reason I did that was because at the time I became fascinated with patristics. I was actually studying the early church fathers, and I'd amassed a significant private library. And then I finished up my AA degree, and then I went ahead and did my bachelor's, and then I did a master's, and then I spent a year off teaching, and then I went and spent 7 years working on my doctorate. And the reason a medieval historian has to spend so much time working on a doctorate is because of all the language training and testing. You have to be able to read, you know, these different languages and not necessarily speak them. I mean, you literally take graduate courses for reading, but and that shortcuts things a little bit. But you know, Latin we don't speak too often anyways, although as Catholics, you know, of course we speak it from time to time. And then and my doctorate was at the University of Florida, where I studied under Florin Curta, who's a great medievalist and now one of my very good friends. And so
so that's how you got involved in history. And what I found so interesting about the book was of this specific book anyway, was most people think that all this thing started with, you know, some Muslims who may have gone a little bit astray, and they became Islamists. And it's just been over the last few decades or so. And it's all the Christians' fault and the Western fault that they start, you know, they're so upset with us, and they want to take us over and everything. but really this goes back to the year, I believe it's 1632, when Muhammad, and I'll let you talk about that, because and people think there's only been 3 crusades, but when I read the book, I found out there's a lot more to this, isn't there?
Yeah, there absolutely is. Interestingly, I was an undergraduate at the University of Florida. I mentioned earlier, initially I was interested in patristics, studying, the early Christian writings during the first 4 centuries. But part of the reason I switched was because I took courses from a very interesting medieval historian while I was working on my master's degree. And I was in a class on the Crusades when September 11th happened in 2001, and it was September, so it's right at the beginning of the fall semester. So then we had the next 3 months where we were exploring these relations between medieval Christians and Muslims as the aftermath of 9/11 was playing out across America, and so that was a very interesting time for me, and an interesting period to be studying medieval history. Something I will say, Bill, you mentioned this narrative that of Muslims and Christians and conflict, and there are sort of 2 views on this. There is and they're within academia, they're often debated, and sometimes it's a very heated issue. There's the clash of civilizations narrative, which is perhaps sort of what you were leaning towards, and what sometimes you see Crusade historians emphasize and other medievalists emphasize as well. Then there's another narrative that suggests that it's much more complex than that, because there have been periods of time throughout history where the 2 religious groups, for example, during the Crusades, the Crusaders established 4 Crusader states, and it was majority Muslim populations that lived under Christian rule, and this is over almost 2-century period. And so the interaction isn't always violent. However, when it is violent, boy, is it explosive, and it's proven that way in many cases. So you're touching on a lot of hot button issues within academia itself, and so these are interesting, topics.
Oh, I didn't realize that I had done anything like that. I'm glad I did, because I really want myself, and I want our viewers to really learn more about how this whole thing started, where we were the Western countries, and I think most people think, well, it was mostly the British, and I guess it was French, German, Spanish, Italians. So there was a lot of I don't know if they were even specifically countries at that time, but areas of the Western European population that were somehow brought into the idea that they needed to go back to the birthplace of Christianity to, and I don't know if I'm doing a very good job of this, go back to the birthplace of Christianity to protect the Holy Land. That's the traditional narrative, and there's much to recommend that narrative. When the First Crusade was called, it was, well, let me go back. When Islam was founded, and when the Prophet Muhammad passes away in the 630s, after Muhammad's death, there's this period of Islamic expansion that lasts from about 632 until around 750 that historians refer to as the Arab conquest. And during this period, from the Hindu Kush to the coast of modern-day Portugal, the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps an enormous amount of land was conquered by Arab armies that had been unified under Muhammad's political rule by the new religion that inspired them with passion and these other things. Well, about 2/3 of those lands were Christian lands. All of North Africa was once Christian, and so on. And so this dramatically changed the equation in the ancient world, in the early medieval world, from about 630 to 750. And from that period on, you do see a lot of conflict between Christian and Muslim forces. You also see a lot of cooperation, as many historians have rightly pointed out, but there's also a lot of conflict, as other historians have pointed out. And so it's a hugely complex topic, and it can vary from one region to another how these people interacted. Now, if you fast forward to the 11th century, because the First Crusade is called by Pope Urban II in the year 1095, what are the events specifically leading up to the calling of that particular crusade?
Well, within the Christian imagination, Jerusalem had always been the Holy Land. It's in their scriptures. Jerusalem is mentioned over and over. And so medieval European Christians in the 11th century were fascinated with the Holy Land. And many were making pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Knights who had done terrible things would go to their confessors, and they'd be given a penance of taking a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And pilgrimages were supposed to be onerous and tough and real burden. Many knights figured they might not survive the pilgrimage because they would have to take vows of the pilgrim's vows, which included chastity and humility and not carrying weapons and things like that. And they'd have to travel across continents on foot. And so many of them just sort of planned to die in the Holy Land. Well, in the late 11th century, you see a few factors emerge. And stop me if I'm going on too long here. I don't mean to.
No, this is fascinating. And we need to know the foundation, the history, and the beginnings of all this.
Well, there's a few things I would say. One, you do see the emergence of a militant group in what would be the Middle East, or we refer to in the medieval world the Near East. You see these Turks emerge on the scene, and the Turks, as it's been described, they had recently converted at that time to Islam, fairly recently. I mean, not the other day, but fairly recently. And so, you know, today the major Islamic peoples are Persians, Arabs, but also the Turks. And this is about the time the Turks enter the picture. And the Turks, when they become Muslim, they have the zeal of the convert, you might say. When they start converting to Islam in large numbers, they attack Arab leaders who are Muslims, who they think are too slack in their faith. But they also attack Christians, and they start harassing all those Christian pilgrims I mentioned earlier. And so the pilgrimage routes are sort of shut down, and there's all this bad news coming out of the Holy Land that's traveling back to what would be medieval Western Europe, to the French kings, to the Holy Roman Emperor, and to others. And there's also the situation of Eastern European monarchs like the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus and others, who start writing letters. These Eastern European Christians, today they would be Eastern Orthodox Christians. You know, they're sort of the ancestral heirs. Well, their kings and emperors were writing letters to Western rulers and to the Pope, and they were asking for military help. At one point in the year 1074, 21 years before Pope Urban II calls the First Crusade, Pope Gregory VII had proposed leading an army of 50,000 knights that he would lead personally to the east to relieve Eastern Christians who were being attacked by the Turks and getting caught up in all this violence. And so finally, after literally 2 decades of lobbying, sending ambassadors, sending Byzantine representatives to show up at Western church councils, Pope Urban II in 1095 calls what becomes later known as the First Crusade. Of course, they didn't call it that at the time, but, you know, over time when so many more are called, they look back historically. Now, Bill, I got to tell you, the First Crusade, you're a former Marine Corps officer, you're a military man, you know your stuff, but the First Crusade was nothing like a professional military venture. There were about 6,000 knights involved, and that's quite a force. But it was more like a town on the move, I've heard it described as. Women participated, a lot of elderly men, a lot of elderly knights participated because they figured they'd rather die in the Holy Land than die at home. They planned to never come back. Thousands of women, the sick. It was a religious pilgrimage, but an armed pilgrimage. And so you get these thousands of people, most of them non-combatants, who head to the Holy Land, but they do have 6,000 knights. But by the time it's over, it was so extraordinary what they pulled off, you might say. They reconquered all these formerly Christian cities and reestablished them under Christian rule. For the Byzantines, that includes Nicaea, most of Asia Minor, and then they established their own crusader states. And so when this crusade was over, Western Europeans, and no kings participated in the First Crusade. They thought it was a fool's errand. They didn't see any possibility of, you know, old ladies and old men succeeding. And but when it was over, Europe was shocked. I mean, Europeans saw crusading as maybe divinely inspired, as, you know, God must have been on their side. And medieval armies, whether Muslim or Christian, would define victory in just that light. It was a sign that God was on your side. Mm-hmm. And this would help define what they considered a holy war, you know, God approved. And so when the First Crusade was so successful, it set a pattern for medieval warfare, a crusading pattern that would be applied during the so-called Reconquista in Spain, against Muslims in the Mediterranean, and other crusades to the Holy Land, and then even later against pagans in Northern Europe and against heretics in the south of France. And so crusading became this new thing that would last for centuries, and a lot of it's based on the success of that first crusade.
So the popular myths, and that's what we can talk about a little bit in your book, the 7 myths, is that there was three crusades. That's what most people believe. And then I've also read and heard people talk about, no, there was really 7 crusades. But in your writings in the book, what you've talked about is there may have been thousands of crusades. There were like mini crusades that maybe didn't even go to the Holy Land. They may have fought the invaders coming into Spain, or the Moors or whatever. And so maybe you could touch on some of that a little bit.
Sure. Historians still debate how many crusades there were, and usually they try to narrow their focus to just the Holy Land, the Crusades of the Holy Land. And of that, they debate if there were 8 or 9. They're not sure if there are 8 or 9 if you count them as late as the year 1270. The last Crusader state in the Holy Land, major state at least, Acre, fell in the late 13th century. And after that, the Crusaders never really returned their presence there. But there were calls for other crusades that never materialized. But the Holy Land Crusades were sort of the most important, the main crusades. But when we say crusades, how do we define it? And there are scholars debate how to define a crusade. Is papal authorization a necessity? Is the giving of an indulgence? Is this pilgrimage aspect of it key to it? Is the location? Does the location matter? Does it have to be to Jerusalem? And so historians have variously defined this in a number of ways. And currently the so-called pluralist school is sort of dominating current scholarship. And the pluralist school holds that so long as a pope calls it and offers spiritual benefits, it can fall, the equivalent of a pilgrimage, I should add, it can fall under the umbrella of a crusade. And so that could be applied, as you mentioned, to non-Muslims, to pagans living in Northern Europe during the so-called Baltic Crusades. This was sort of European paganism's last best stand, and the Crusaders eliminated that and established Christianity in those regions. And then there was the Reconquista, which is a loose term. I mean, the Reconquista is a problematic term, but there had been conflict between Christians and Muslims going back to the year 711. Now, this wasn't nonstop conflict, but it would periodically strike up, and there was a certain Christian memory in Spain that Spain had once been Christian and no longer was. And so when the crusading model emerges in the 11th, 12th century, really, it's applied to Spain. It's applied to efforts in Spain periodically there. And then also heretics in the south of France, the Albigensians, or the Cathars as they're known. Some historians have suggested they were sort of a quasi-alternative church, and others have said, no, that's not really the case. But whatever the case, there was a dissenting group in France, and the Catholic Church of the 12th, 13th century had been aware of them for a long time. They had sent saints like Bernard of Clairvaux, perhaps the most important clerical voice of the 12th century, to preach against them, and they had sent preaching missions for decades. And then finally in the year 1209, a papal legate in the region, a papal ambassador, was murdered, and this led to the calling of a crusade against them. And so crusading has been applied on a number of fronts and in a number of capacities. Most people only really know about the Crusades of the Holy Land. So when Crusade historians talk to them, most of the time we just kind of stick to that to keep it simple, without getting on everything I've been going on and on about. But the ones to Jerusalem are the most well-known, and perhaps, in my opinion, the most interesting. So,
So I guess of the 7 myths, one of the biggest myths that I hear is there seems to be 2 sides. One side is that the Christians were, pilgrims going to the Holy Land and reconquering the Holy Land. And the other one is the Christians were the most evil, bloodthirsty people in the planet has ever known, and they went over there for one purpose only, and that was just to slaughter Muslims who were defenseless and didn't have any any way of defending themselves, and we just completely invaded their land. But then after I'm reading your book, what I'm learning is that Syria and Egypt were really the centers of Christianity all the way up until the year 600 and maybe 32 or whatever, when the Islamists or the Muslims started their conquest. And so most people don't understand that history, and I guess I didn't really know about it myself, so I'm as guilty as anybody, but your book really brought that out. But in the book, you talk about the 7 myths, and you actually have 7 authors who write about their specific myths. So maybe we could get into that a little bit. And
sure, no, absolutely. Bill, you were referring to the first myth. Paul Crawford wrote this. It's been popularly assumed for, and the emphasis is on the word popularly, assumed for a long time that the Crusaders were sort of these, men drunk with violence and a lust for violence, and they head off and they make war on these peaceful Muslim populations that were sort of minding their own business. And that's a popular narrative. It's led to some Christian groups in the 1990s, issuing formal apologies for the First Crusade. It's led to a whole host of situations where the popes have been called on to apologize and so on. But historians who study the Crusades understand that this requires much greater nuance and complexity. The First Crusade, as I mentioned earlier, from about 1071 on, Eastern Christians, the Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Roman Empire in the Middle Ages, was a Christian empire, and it was suffering dramatic military losses to Muslim forces, to those newly emergent Turks. And as I mentioned, there were almost 2 decades of active recruiting. I mean, as Peter Frankopan in his recent book on the First Crusade has pointed out, prior to the First Crusade, the Byzantines had even set up a recruiting center for Western warriors in London, and had been actively sending envoys to the King of Croatia, to the papacy, to Robert of Flanders, to all these important members of the nobility. And it was all, and in each of these letters, they were complaining about Christians being attacked and abused and mistreated by these newly aggressive, I should have emphasized, newly aggressive Muslim leaders, whereas there had been more stable relations prior to that between Christians and Muslims. And so anyways, these attacks and this effort on the part of Eastern Christians to get some military help are what leads to the calling of the First Crusade. It's not an attack that's out of nowhere. The conditions are there. There's Eastern Christians that their cities are being conquered, they're being enslaved, many are being killed. The ancient city of Nicaea had been conquered just shortly prior to the First Crusade. And as you might know, as a Catholic, that Nicaea was the site of 2 majorly important church councils, the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed. And I mean, these were important Christian cities. The city of Antioch had been captured shortly before the calling of the First Crusade. That was the very place that Christians had first gotten the name Christian as a form of derision. And so these are important historic cities. And so this is no small thing that these attacks are happening. And the First Crusade is framed by the papacy as when they preach it as a response to these attacks. And so in that context, in that particular context, I can see it as other historians like Thomas Madden, Jonathan Riley Smith, and other prominent historians with much better reputations than mine have framed it as a defensive effort, a defensive war even. And yet this doesn't sit well with most people today who hear of the Crusades, and they just automatically assume it's based on some sort of anti-Muslim bigotry, that they're unaware of all these circumstances that led up to it, that as Jonathan Riley Smith has pointed out, it was, he's argued very explicitly that it was Muslim aggression that was the cause of the First Crusade, And so, but anyways, that's myth number one of the most controversial. But there are other myths that are not as controversial, although still compelling. I should mention my friend Paul F. Crawford wrote that myth Paul is an American historian. He teaches at California University of Pennsylvania, and he's an aggressive writer. He's a good friend, and I was glad to see him write this. Myth 2 is Mad Men on Crusade, and this myth looks at the idea that the Crusaders were in a religious frenzy, essentially. James Muldoon, the retired professor at Rutgers University, and a good friend of mine, he and I co-edited a volume of translated sources. Jim writes this one, and he emphasizes that crusading had an intellectual component, the development of it institutionally, canon law, that even when the first Crusaders left, you know, they waited until the seasons had come in, they could properly feed themselves. There wasn't this madness, you know, it was well planned. I mean, if you're going to move 60,000 people across continents, you better have some logistics. Again, you as a Marine Corps officer would know. And imagine doing this in the Middle Ages when you can't get air resupply, when you don't have motorized vehicles and so on. You know, it's just not going to happen. A young scholar named Daniel Frank wrote about Judaism and the Crusades. And Dan provides one of the most wonderfully nuanced chapters I've seen on this subject yet, on the historiography of crusading, because there were some crusades that resulted in anti-Jewish violence. The First Crusade was one of the most notorious, where perhaps 3,000 Jews were killed by these German crusaders. Now, the First Crusade was mostly French crusaders, but there was a German component, and the German attackers seem, based on the sources, seem to have rationalized that if they're going to the Holy Land to face the infidel there, why not face the infidel, you know, at home? And so they attacked Jews. Now, no crusade was ever called against the Jews, and the papacy condemned these attacks, and there were efforts made in later crusades to make sure this doesn't happen. In fact, at one point, after this happened, the Pope, even at the time, as well as the Holy Roman Emperor, agreed to allow Jews who had been forcibly converted by these sort of renegade crusaders to revert back to Judaism even after they'd been baptized, which was unheard of in the Middle Ages. In other words, the church made efforts, you know, to address these things. But Daniel Frank, Professor Frank, also argues, though, that the Crusades there is this element of you know, sort of feistiness that happens at the beginning of each crusade that results in sometimes small or greater scale violence against Jews. And so this isn't a component that needs to be studied more, and he provides an up-to-date view of that. And I know I'm probably taking too much time, aren't I, Bill? Or should I tick off the last four as quickly as I can?
No,
okay.
And it's interesting you brought that up, because I never knew about you know, the Germans and you know, and converting the Jews, and I guess when they first get started on these crusades / pilgrimages, they're very zealous, very zealous. You know, and really they're hyped up. In other words.
At least some groups are. Now, the Germans who did this to the Jews, and these were brutal attacks, and medieval Jewish communities, they feared crusades for this reason. Modern Jewish communities look back pretty harshly on the Crusades because of their historical understanding of it. But in this case, these German crusaders, and this is unsettled, the historians still debate this, but they were Germans themselves, and maybe they had a particular political aim in mind by attacking these German Jewish communities. In other words, it's not like the Flemish and the French and the English and others who participated in the First Crusade, mostly the French, were attacking their Jewish communities. You know, there may be some unique features, but there were other attacks on Jews later in the Crusades, and it's a complex topic. And so Dan, my friend Daniel Frank, he explores this, and he can do it much better justice than I can, at least in his well-thought-out chapter where he outlines all these issues, and he triangulates three popular views of crusading. But then the fourth chapter, The Quest for Gain, were the first crusaders proto-colonists. Crusade historians today have largely rejected the idea that the crusaders were colonists. This is a controversial topic, Bill, because many modern critics of the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, will argue it's a sort of Western crusader state, which is very odd when you consider it's a Jewish state. And of course, the Jews don't see themselves as crusaders. They see themselves historically as victims of crusading. And they see, but nevertheless, they see Israel as a sort of Western imperialist colonial power. And there have been arguments that this type of colonialism dates back to European colonialism, dates back to the First Crusade, when these crusader states were established. And so from that, you get the argument that the Crusaders were greedy. They were just going out there to steal land. They didn't have genuine spirituality in mind. There was no effort really to protect fellow Christians. It was all just a scam because they wanted to get rich quick. But historians reject that argument overwhelmingly. About 35, 40 years ago, a major historian at Cambridge University, a guy named Jonathan Riley Smith, started writing a number of books, and he's become, until his death recently, he had become the leading living scholar of the Crusades. Again, he passed away recently, but literally like a year ago. But his 12 or 13 books have come to dominate how historians now see that. And they see crusading as not about material gain. In fact, he even had a seminal, important article that was titled, oddly enough, Crusading as an Act of Love, because it was understood it would be such a hardship. And there was a 75% casualty rate on the First Crusade. I mean, if you participated in these crusades, you were probably going to get killed. If not, you were at least going to get wounded. And it was going to cost you 3 years, because these were all self-funded. This wasn't like a modern military. Every one of them had to pay for their own way for 3 years. And so it caused a lot of suffering, and that's what made it penitential. And so he's emphasized that rather than getting rich, their anxieties were about how to afford the hardships of it, And so Corliss Slack looks at these issues, and she does a nice job on this chapter. And then chapter 5, the making of the Children's Crusade. A friend of mine, David Scheffler, wrote the chapter there. He's currently the chair of the history department at the University of North Florida. And the Children's Crusade is often portrayed very negatively as well. The Crusaders were so bad that they even had a Children's Crusade bill, where all these 6-year-olds march off to the Holy Land, and they all get enslaved, and they all get killed. And that's how ugly medieval Europeans were, that they would let these kids do this. But of course, that's silly. That's just not, likely or even true. There's an issue there with the Latin as well. The Latin word for boy is puer, for plural is pueri, and the context in which it was used in some of these sources, as one historian has argued, it could mean a non-landowning man up to age 30, in the same way that in the antebellum U.S. South, a slave owner might have referred to a 50-year-old male slave as boy, derogatorily, negatively. It was more about status. It doesn't mean he was actually 6 years old, and so on. And so this is a complex issue. Most historians agree, though, that it's overwhelmingly myth, one way or another. Now, there might have been some young figureheads that were associated. David gets into this in detail in this chapter for anybody who's interested. And then Jace Stuckey, another friend of mine, he also studied at the University of Florida under my mentor, Florin Curta. He wrote a book about the Templars and the Masons, because there's probably no organization that historically, or few organizations that have received as much sort of silly press as the Templars, and the Masons have tried to sort of redefine themselves as a modern, the modern descendants of these medieval Templars. There's a great quotation at the beginning of his chapter, which I'll just read a couple lines, where he is quoting Umberto Eco, the great medievalist. He notes, and I'll quote, "There are lunatics who don't bring up the Templars, but those who do are the most insidious. At first they seem normal, and then all of a sudden they bring up the Templars." And so he dispels this notion that there's any historical connection between the Masons and the Templars. And then finally, one of the most interesting chapters in the book, one of the most important, I think, is by Edward Peters, formerly of the University of Pennsylvania, the Ivy League school, and former editor-in-chief of the University of Pennsylvania Press. He and a former doctoral student of his, Mona Hamad, co-authored this chapter, Islam and the Crusades, a 900-year-long grievance. And Dr. Hamad teaches at the University of Jordan, and so she's very familiar with modern Muslim views of crusading. And then, of course, Edward Peters is involved, and he's a huge name, probably one of the leading medievalists of the last, American medievalists of the last 30 years. And they wrote a wonderful chapter about how a lot of the current modern Muslim memory that's used to incite some of the more radical elements in the Islamic world is largely a falsehood that's invented in the 19th or 20th century. Muslim historians didn't really write about the Crusades. In the 18th, 17th, 16th century, when Muslim writers wrote about Islamic history, they didn't care about the Crusaders. They were worried about the Mongols, because the Mongols had caused so much damage and were such a powerful force that wipes out Islamic rule in Baghdad and does all these things. The Crusaders were a sort of minor speed bump before you see Turkish expansion, into Eastern Europe and all these areas under the Ottoman Empire, which remained a threat as late as the 19th century. And so the Crusaders didn't factor much in their history. But then in the early 20th century, when Western colonial powers had a lot of strength in the Middle East, then the emphasis shifts back to early Europeans who had been to the Middle East, e.g. the Crusaders, And so this whole narrative of Crusaders as the first European oppressors begins to develop, but it's not a very nuanced narrative, and many historians have highlighted the problems with that narrative, which we don't really have the time to get into here. But you can see how each one of these 7 stories could be the basis for its own book, and many books have been written on each of these topics. Mm-hmm. All this book is trying to do is give a current snapshot of where the history's at right now, what historians are writing about these current topics, and trying to highlight how different what historians write about these topics is from what is popularly assumed, from what you see online, from what you see in movies, And so we're just showing that historians and the popular imagination are 2 different things.
Okay. I'm glad you brought all that up also, and you took us all the way up to the Ottoman Turks, which really were being driven back and defeated all the way up until World War I believe, because we've seen these movies like Gallipoli and so forth that all happened in Turkey. That was really sort of the real demise or end of the Ottoman Turks. But one of the points I wanted to make for any of those who are watching this, and I want you to read this book, is as Dr. Holt has just explained, there's books that could be written on every one of these chapters, but for the layman like myself and like the rest of us, I thought this book actually almost read like a novel, and that's what it made it so much easier to read, because I know I've tried to read some history books, and you have to admit, they can be very difficult to read, and so to educate the people in America as to the myths of the Crusades and what this is really, the historical significance of it is to be able to read something that goes into good depth, but it's easy to read. It reads like a novel. And even at the end of each chapter, when I'm reading this, there's the references. I read the references because some of those were really easy to read, and I learned a lot about them. So I thought this book was really so well portrayed. Scholars obviously would relish this because of all the detail and the references and so forth. But for the average person like myself, to me, it was just a godsend to be able to learn so much, and the way it was presented was so well.
That's very kind of you. I really do appreciate that. Thank you very much, Bill. When we wrote this book, when we put it together, we weren't writing it for other scholars. It was important that we would be able to communicate these messages we were focusing on college students, to undergraduates and maybe your beginning grad students, as well as well-read lay readers, as they say, and so on. And so that was our focus, to show where the scholarship is. And so your kind comments are much appreciated, because it suggests that that we were able to work that out. So, yeah.
Well, I just learned something. I guess I would be in the category of a well-read lay reader. I never thought of myself that way, but I typically read about a book a week. In fact, I'm reading 3 books right now, and people say, how can you do that? And I say, I don't know. I guess I've always kind of done that, And with a Kindle, it's very easy to do.
That's wonderful.
Are there any other works that you published that you can tell us about?
You know, they aren't really the kind, though, that like most people would go and buy. I recently co-edited a 3-volume encyclopedia on pivotal events in religious history, but the focus of that sort of project is really for research libraries and the college
Mm.
libraries. Because they're expensive, and academic presses are very expensive in general. However, Hackett, who published the 7 Myths of the Crusades, is doing a wonderful job in putting out the more expensive hardback, you know, that the libraries have to buy, but also in putting out a $19 paperback so that it's affordable for students. But normally, with most academic presses, the prices are very high. So yeah, I mean, I recently put out that encyclopedia. I'm currently writing a 2-volume encyclopedia on the Crusades for another press, and I've got some other, you know, other things going here, other fires or irons in the fire, as they say, right?
Hmm.
But yeah, this was really the main project for the last several years, and so I appreciate you giving me a chance to come on here and talk about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, and books like this, the soft covers, and it used to be the paperbacks were like about half this size or smaller, and that's what everybody carried around. But these are just so great. They're so easy to handle and so easy to read and take with you. And this is a book that. And what I like about this book is I kind of relate to it in my book, where I say, okay, you can read a chapter in about 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and then you can set it down. If you can't come back the next day or 2 days later, it's okay. Where if you read this book, you can read one of the chapters, and then if you don't have time, you can come back a day or two later and pick up the next one, and you haven't really lost any continuity of it. It's just the way it's written is just so great.
Hey, Bill, may I jump in? Earlier, you asked me about my co-editor, Alfred J. Andrea, and
Yes.
I ran through the chapters. I forgot to talk about Al, but Al is a retired professor, University of Vermont, former head of the World History Organization. He's in his 70s, and he's flying all over the world, and he's hiking at all these exotic destinations. And he's a former Marine too, I might add. And he's got all this wonderful energy. And I was actually a graduate student in 2007, I think, when I approached him about the 7 Myths book, because an academic press at the time wouldn't publish me. I didn't have my PhD, and so they don't tend to consider students. And but he was a retired scholar with this great reputation, so I remember presenting it to him at a history conference, and he patiently listened, and he liked the idea. And so when Al signed on, and when we had his name, that's really what made it easy to get the others to sign up to write all these chapters. You know, Edward Peters, University of Pennsylvania Press, for heaven's sakes. And so Al was wonderful, and it was a great opportunity for me as a junior scholar to work under a senior scholar in the production of this book. The only thing is, we ended up taking about 8 years to finally complete this small book, and that was because at the time he was editing a 21-volume encyclopedia all by himself, and I was completing a dissertation and writing some articles and doing some other things. But it slowly came together. But I just wanted to give a little shout out to Al, as they say. And then one other thing, Rick Todhunter at Hackett Publishing was the guy who helped us set all this up. He's a senior editor there, and he's been wonderful. And we've actually put together a series, a 7 Myths series. And we've had other books come out recently on the 7 Myths of Africa and world history, the 7 Myths of the Civil War, one on Native American history, and others in the pipeline. So we're publishing a whole series that follows this exact model. You know, what scholars say about an issue versus popular assumptions.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to ask you about that because in reading the book, I saw that about the 7 myths, and so we can look forward to learning about, like you say, Africa. What were some of the other topics that?
The Civil War, Native American history. We have stuff that's in the works on the Renaissance, World War II, on and on. And we have leading scholars in each case that are overseeing the production of these books. And it's using the exact same format, under 200 pages, $19 for paperback, 7 chapters dispelling 7 myths, because we think it's a digestible format and approach. And also, frankly, we're trying to get these used in the classroom. You know, we want these books assigned to undergrads and so on. So we want professors to feel comfortable about assigning them.
Okay, wow, that's awesome that you're doing that. So I just feel like it's so credible, and like I learned so much. So Andrew, what do you have for the future? Continuing on, and I presume you're at Florida. Is it Florida State College or Florida?
It's Florida State College at Jacksonville, not to be confused with FSU. Florida State College at Jacksonville was sort of a godsend to me because when I become what they call ABD while I was working on my PhD, all but dissertation. In other words, I finished all my coursework, my language exams, everything done except for the disc. They hired me full time, and as a father of 3 children and with a wife, I desperately needed a job, and so I was grateful to them, and they gave me a job. And then over the next 3 years while I worked there, I completed my dissertation and graduated with my PhD. And they've been really good to me. I really enjoyed it there, and so I don't have any intention of moving, and I haven't been applying elsewhere. That could always change. Recently, my wife was hired as a professor of nursing there, so now there's 2 Professor Holt's, and if we have a student call the house and ask for Professor Holt, we get a little confused, as you might imagine. So we're pretty happy where we're at, and we're not anticipating moving on. But the FSCJ gives us a lot of tools, and like I said, they've been very good to us. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's really great. Okay, I guess what we need to do is let everybody watching that you need to get this book, and I mean, get it and read it, and you can really learn a whole lot about what is one of the hottest topics in America today, or the biggest, maybe the biggest threat in America today is are we being conquered by Islam, and is Islam just a theocracy, and are they out to spread a caliphate that's worldwide and so forth? Well, we need to know about that, and this certainly gives us a good foundation in that. So, Dr. Holt, I want to thank you very much for being our guest today. It's been enlightening, and I'm just really excited and thrilled that you were able to join us on the American Vision.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Bill. Again, I really do appreciate it.
Okay, very good. Okay, boys and girls, I'll end with my usual saying that where there is no vision, the people perish, and where the Americans have no vision, the Americans will perish. So God bless you all, and God save our America.